High performance networking is changing our planet, changing our nation, and it is changing the state of Oregon. I'm Charla Bocchicchio, and my guest today is the Executive Director of Link Oregon, Steve Corbató. Welcome to the SC20 News Desk, Steve.
It's great to be here.
Before we talk about Link Oregon, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about your first experience with the SC conferences.
I had actually done some research computing when I was a postdoc, and I remember seeing the posters for, I guess, the first SC in 1987, but I didn't get there till 1999. I was living in Portland, and it was sort of an accidental event. I went to a downtown hotel to drop off Women's World Cup soccer tickets to a colleague who happened to be attending a meeting of the SC99 Executive Committee. And I went I went up to the floor. The Executive Committee was having a party, and I didn't get out of there until about 3 or 4 hours later. But as I was leaving the party, now emeritus computer science professor at Oregon State University, Dr. Sherry Pancake, pretty aggressively threw me up against the wall and said, "What are you going to do for SC99?" So that was my introduction to the event, and I was local. I was working for the University of Washington, and we actually pulled off a network demonstration that year with a 2.5 gigabit per second line from Seattle. And I've been to the event 15 times ever since. But that was my that was my introduction to supercomputing, and I've always shared a laugh with Sherry Pancake whenever I've seen her, when I remind her of how she recruited me.
That's great. Sometimes it takes a strong hand, I guess, doesn't it?
And she's an outstanding leader.
Thank you. What is Link Oregon? Let's delve in. What is it, and why is it important right now?
So we're a relatively new state optical network. We're a partnership of the 4 research universities in Oregon: University of Oregon, Oregon State University, Portland State University, and Oregon Health and Science University, as well as the state government. And we essentially have built a statewide optical network. We're in the process of turning up new segments now, but our goal is really to have a network that supports education, especially research and healthcare statewide. And what's unique about us is we actually formed as a nonprofit. Oregon doesn't have a state system of higher ed, or what I would say is a dominant research university, as some states do. So we're really a partnership, and we have a very strategic board. Our number one job is to run a network, but at the same time, we're configured in a way that we can support other projects, and we're already engaging in research computing collaborations, very interested in trust and identity. So I view it as setting up a platform for the research universities and our partners to use essentially in advanced IT.
Gotcha. And I think I'm pretty sure we have a graphic if you'd like to talk about that at all, to add anything.
Yeah, and this is provides some sense of not only the state of Oregon, but also our footprint. And Oregon is really a tale of 2 states. We have the Cascade Mountains that run north and south. On the west side of that, it's much moister. It's much more densely populated, and we have increasing population on the coast. In eastern Oregon, it's at least in the southeastern part, is really high, Great Basin high desert. There are a number of data centers over on the east side now. You see those as red circles on this diagram. Mm-hmm. And we also on the west side, Oregon has the highest density of trans-Pacific network cables that land along the west coast. So we have a lot of we source a lot of data, and we transit a lot of data. And what we've done in building this network is we've positioned ourselves to collaborate with the commercial entities that are either running the transoceanic cables or running the major data centers.
It sounds like a really great network that you guys have gotten started there. How how did you come to Link Oregon? What is your background, and what made you get
Well,
involved?
I've been around computing and IT throughout my career. I actually started out in experimental astrophysics. I was actually at the University of Utah as a researcher back in the 90s, and drifted into advanced networking. I've worked at the campus, the regional, and the national levels, and I've also worked in campus IT leadership roles. I think high performance computing is always driven, and other science initiatives. There's certainly a Large Hadron Collider at CERN that has driven a lot of network development. And
Mm-hmm.
I think from my perspective, having the network close to these activities is a very good way, one, to stimulate growth, but also to learn how well the network performs.
Gotcha. So how is HPC networking being deployed by Link Oregon?
We have a couple projects that I should highlight, one of which is that Oregon State University recently became the cyber infrastructure provider for the Ocean Observing Initiative. That's a National Science Foundation project, a large-scale, long-term research project that has put fiber and instrumentation on the bottom of the ocean offshore. And so OSU has stepped up and has taken on that responsibility. That will certainly drive a lot of our data traffic to the other collaborating institutions up and down the West Coast, and also at Woods Hole. We also are partnering with a unique effort at the University of Oregon, which is based around real-time detection of wildfires and also earthquakes. Alert Wildfire and Shake Alert are the two sort of faces of that project, but they're basically remote instrumentation platforms, and we view them as a fantastic collaborator. That project has helped drive our network expansion into the very remote part of southeastern Oregon, which is true Great Basin territory, low population, little water, but and certainly a great deal of wildfire risk.
Mm-hmm. You may have already addressed this as much as you want, but how has your background in information technology at Internet 2 and UETN helped prepare you to lead this initiative at Link Oregon?
That's an interesting question, because I do think about that a lot. I had an opportunity at a rather young age to lead the national network, which is now known as the Internet 2 network. And I did that for about 5 years. And then I went back to Utah, and I was on the board and earlier the advisory group of the Utah Education and Telehealth Network. I learned a lot at both stops. I think at the national level, I essentially got a sense for how the states interact and how important presenting a common face for a Western state in DC, with the funding agencies in Washington, DC is. At Utah, in many ways, Utah is a very representative model for some of the challenges that we're working to solve in Oregon. Oregon's on the West Coast, and we've got about 4.5 million people. To the north, we have Washington State now, which is double in size, and of course California, which is essentially the fifth largest economy in the world, or that. So the analogies with Utah are interesting. We have population that's concentrated in one area. Our research universities are in that area, and the same is true in Utah. And we both have significant rural and truly frontier areas that we need to serve. I'm lucky that I spent in total, I think, about 15 years of my career at the University of Utah, and I was involved as a user of UETN in 1993, just as it was starting. And in many ways, we look to some of the structures that they've established, and particularly, I'd say, building trust among communities.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's true whether you're working with research computing colleagues or whether you're working in the K-12 sector or in healthcare or with the libraries. It really comes down to building trust and conveying a mission of what you're trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for Oregon, we have a lot of assets. We're Intel's largest presence in the United States. We have a large number of data centers, and we have a set of strong research universities. I think Link Oregon's job is to link those various initiatives and assets together, and to serve as a platform for collaboration, and particularly statewide collaboration with ourselves and with other states, so that Oregon can be more competitive nationally.
So how are you and your colleagues collaborating to address the COVID pandemic specifically?
I think if I think about the start of the pandemic in Oregon, we were fortunate in some ways in that we could look to the north in Seattle, which is about 150 miles north of Portland, and the the pandemic started burning hard in Seattle just as it did in New York City. So that really gave us time to galvanize as a state. I think Oregon has done a good job as a state. We're, I think, in the bottom 20% in terms of per capita caseload and the other metrics for the disease. For us, it has provided a real opportunity. And quite frankly, I told our staff that I expected opportunities to emerge because of the pandemic. They probably happened faster than I anticipated. We were able to get some CARES Act funding through the support of our governor and our legislature, and that has put our network build out into Eastern and Southern Oregon on a fast track to be completed by the end of this year. So I think that's, all our institutions are focused very much on ensuring that their students and their faculty, staff, and their employees, in the case of state government, have good local access. I think we've learned in this state that the fraction of the population that doesn't have real broadband is about 20 to 25%. And that's gone from being a nuisance to now a socioeconomic barrier. It takes you out of telehealth, it takes you out of remote education, it takes you out of remote work. And I think the interesting thing, tying this back to high performance computing, it's not that long ago that the kind of bandwidths that we're talking about that are really needed in the home were the bandwidths that tied campuses to national backbones.
Right.
And I guess it demonstrates the inevitable progression of technology, and that we know science and high performance computing will always be out on the vanguard. I think for us, we see. I think it's going to drive more detection efforts. One of the things that has complicated the pandemic in Oregon was the summer wildfire season.
Oh, right.
And we're going to see more active measurement efforts, and it's not just around fire and landslides, but we're also interested now in water quality, because we've had some communities that were literally destroyed, and those sites now represent very risky areas in terms of hazardous materials and the like that can get into watersheds. So we see a lot of, I think it's been in some ways a boon for interdisciplinary research, and also a recognition that we need a greater degree of instrumentation, atmospheric, wildfire detection, geotechnical detectors out in the field. And I think that's something where we believe that Link Oregon can lead out.
Excellent. Are there any other ways, you've addressed this to a certain degree, are there any other ways that you think the pandemic will change the face of HP and higher education, for example?
Well, I think we've always felt that one of the goals of the internet was to make location irrelevant.
Mhm.
That you could have a collaboration that was statewide, national, or international. And a lot of these ideas were theoretical, and leading edge research groups would, could build international collaborations and build the tools. Everybody needs it now, and I think one of the places where what I think will happen is that education will change. We'll probably see less investment in bricks and mortar, and more investments in distance-based technology. And I think higher education has to work with partners more than ever, whether they're libraries or K-12, to ensure that rural communities and communities where students come from are actually sufficiently wired so those students are not at a disadvantage. So I think it's brought attention, essentially, higher education and the advanced networking community's role in the community. I'm getting pulled into the rural broadband projects, and in some cases, we've had wildfires significantly damage telecommunications infrastructure. So there's a greater awareness now, I think, of our community, and that we can play a role. And it's, we're particularly concerned about K-12.
Right.
And from a higher education perspective, K-12 is the basically delivers the product in a crass way. And when that system is challenged, that ultimately will affect higher education. I think that's motivated many of us around those initiatives.
Absolutely. It seems like it's all about accessibility.
It's about accessibility. It's about ubiquity. I think one of the things that has happened in the pandemic is a recognition that national broadband standards need to change. The Federal Communications Commission has a standard of 25 megabits per second for downloads and 3 megabits per second for uploads. What I call the Zoom transition in mid-March during the pandemic has demonstrated that's not sufficient bandwidth, particularly for a household that has multi-tenant video conferences under.
Absolutely.
And the other, so I think there is a need for that to be reconsidered, and I think higher education, our partners, can lead out on that. And I also think in the broadband space, just as with COVID, without accurate data, you're really shooting in the dark. And I sense this country is going to make a major investment in trying to address the residual population that truly lacks real broadband. So having accurate data, accurate maps before we start spending billions of dollars, that's critical. And I also think, going back to that first point, setting a higher bar on what the bandwidth is before we go spending a lot of money and wind up with an inferior product.
Yeah. Excellent. Steve, is there anything else that you wanted to add that we didn't get to before we close?
If I think about some of the research computing drivers in Oregon, we have a set of higher education assets that are distributed throughout the Willamette Valley. The Academic Medical Center is in Portland. The Liberal Arts University is about 100 miles to the south in Eugene. We now have a collaboration between two centers funded by Phil Knight of Nike fame. One is a cancer institute at the OHSU, the Academic Medical Center Portland. The other is a life science campus that's under development at the University of Oregon. So the network is important, and approaches to handling research computing and also handling personal health information in those type of distributed research collaborations. We've got great leadership at the University of Oregon for research computing in Nick Maggio. Nick is really pushing the envelope in how we work with cloud providers in the state and how we take advantage of what the cloud has, as well as sort of the intrinsic advantages of when a higher education institution owns its own high performance computing assets. We also have a very strong collaboration among campuses, each one recognizing that there's significant benefits to be gained by collaborating. We've Professor Brett Tyler at Oregon State University has led out in a NSF Campus Cyber Infrastructure Award that involves other campuses. And Brett has been really a statewide and a national leader, particularly with an eye towards getting data science into rural communities. We've seen data science adopted by the city of Chicago and other large cities, but Brett has made a very compelling case for rural communities adopting that same methodology, and particularly in assuring that students in those communities get access to data science curricula so that they can actually be as well prepared when they enter college as students from the larger cities.
Right. It's interesting. I'm noticing a theme that keeps coming up in the people that I've been talking with about collaboration.
Yeah.
And I love that you're bringing it up again here. I think it's so important right now.
Yeah. I learned this at the University of Utah. I was associated for a few years with Scientific Computing and Imaging Institute, SCI there. And it's in SCI's genetic makeup to collaborate. I think the problems now are harder. The easy problems have been solved, and you really need interdisciplinary teams.
Yeah. All right. Well, Steve, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. We've been talking with Steve Corbató, the Executive Director of Link Oregon. I'm Charla Bocchicchio in Salt Lake City, inviting you to stay tuned for more interviews from the SC20 News Desk.